Hello, welcome to my presentation on industrial organizational psychology. I really enjoyed researching all of this history and I'm excited to share what I have found with you. So let's get started with the goals. If you would just like to take a moment to pause the video and go over the goals by yourself, please feel free to do so. Here's the agenda. I'm going to split this presentation up in about two parts. The first part being the IO psychology defined, with three pillars of IO psychology, and then the second part being the Hawthorne Studies and the overall contribution to society. I want to start by defining IO psychology a little better for you. Industrial organizational psychology is a study of human behavior in the workplace. So we can organize the field in two major components, and from there we can get specific with the kinds of research that psychologists are doing in this field. So we have the industrial side, which includes job analysis, training, selection, and performance. This was heavily emphasized during the emergence of the subfield. And then we have the organizational side that concerns itself more with the human element of the workplace. So we're talking about motivation, leadership, culture, all the good stuff. When I was conducting my research on the history of the subfield, I noticed that there were basically three major events, or three pillars. I feel without these three events, IO psychology would not have existed. So let's start with the Wundt. The first major event is the establishment of the Wundt Institute of Experimental Psychology at Leipzig University in Germany. Wilhelm Wundt was the founder of modern psychology, basically. The establishment of this program helped distinguish psychology from philosophy by making psychology an empirically based science. Before, we didn't have really any scientific, empirically based studies going on in psychology because it was lumped in with philosophy. This institute was also important because there were several psychologists who studied under Wundt and later made major contributions to the field of psychology. So pictured from left to right, we have Harlow Gale, obviously not a fan of photos, E.W. Scripture, James McKean Cattell, Walter Dill Scott, and the grandfather of IO psychology, Ugo Munsterberg. Ugo Munsterberg was a psychology lab director at Harvard. He didn't exactly study IO psychology because this was still before the time it became a distinct subfield. He did, however, write books about the consulting work he did for businesses. The topics included employee selection, vocational guidance, training, monotony, attention, fatigue, social and physical influences on work, advertising, selling, and buying. So basically, this guy knew a lot about businesses from the perspective of not only the buyer, but also the seller and the employee. So if we take a closer look at the American industry during the time of Munsterberg's contributions, we can get a better insight as to why his work was so important and how it really helped set the mood for what we know as modern day industrial organizational psychology. So all of this was happening about 15 years before the Great Depression. So around the same time that Munsterberg was doing this important work, the factory industry was growing in America. Thanks to immigrants in the early 20th century, there were a lot of people ready and available for work. These factories also provided a new environment for humans to be studied in. So just like today, the goal back in the early 1900s was to produce efficiently and sell as much as possible. Luckily, psychologists were there to help figure out how to do this. What we find are two approaches to helping businesses grow. Taylorism, which is this guy here, and then those who are a little more sympathetic to the human element. So Frederick W. Taylor, he's an engineer, father of scientific management. Some say he was a great manager and a genius at increasing output, and others say he wasn't so considerate. Not really a far cry from some of the managers I've personally worked under in the service industry. Taylor basically boiled down management to a perfect science. He measured everything he could when it came to business output and work efficiency, and basically prescribed a system for every process that went on in that business. After he discovered the perfect process, he shared this information with factory workers and told them exactly how to do their job. To me, he seemed very mechanically minded, and I honestly would expect nothing less of an engineer. And next we have Frank and Lillian Gilberth. Frank and Lillian were partners. Frank was a bricklayer and Lillian was a psychologist, and together they worked. They really appreciated Taylor's contributions to the industry and expanded upon his ideas. They worked together to analyze tasks to make workers more efficient, very similar to Taylor. But the difference between these two lovebirds and Frederick Taylor is the Gilbreths also considered the human element by concerning themselves with worker safety. Much of their analysis was focused on mitigating accidents in the workplace and worker fatigue. The third major event that helped really solidify IO psychology as a legitimate subfield is World War I. Here we have two men who helped bring psychology to the war, Walter Dill Scott and Robert Yerkes, both highly respected psychologists in World War I. Let's take a closer look at Walter Dill Scott. Walter Dill Scott was a highly decorated von alum. He was the first professor of applied psychology. He started the Scott Company, which was the first industrial psychology consulting firm, and he also received a Distinguished Service Medal for his contribution to the war. So he was a highly decorated psychologist from one of the most important schools, the Wundt Institute for Experimental Psychology. His services to World War I include developing rating scales for the purpose of selecting and rating officers. He also worked to define specific trades and how they relate to specific occupations. And if you think this wasn't enough, Scott took it one step further, and not only did he define trades and place them within their appropriate occupation field, he also developed standardized tests for soldiers to be able to see which soldiers would be best for any particular job. Along with Scott, Robert Yerkes was a key player in bringing industrial psychology to the war. Yerkes developed the Army Alpha and Army Beta test. The Alpha was for people who had a basic command of the English language, and the Beta was given to those who had no literacy in English. So everybody was able to take this test. These tests were basic intelligence tests designed to select and classify recruits. And I know we have one military veteran in our cohort who is familiar with the ASVAB, but for anybody else who is not familiar, the ASVAB is an aptitude test that in 2020 and current times, recruits take before they join the armed forces. And this test is given to every recruit in every branch of the military. We can consider the ASVAB our modern day Army Alpha and Army Beta tests. Yerkes also helped prove that conducting tests on large groups is doable and cost effective. So standardized testing. After taking a closer look at the components of IO psychology and the three major events that help shape the field, it's time to look at one of the most important studies in industrial organizational psychology, the Hawthorne Studies. The Hawthorne Studies were conducted at a Western Electric Company in Hawthorne, Illinois. The study was originally designed to study the impact of illumination on worker output. The results were inconclusive because the findings were inconsistent. The researcher realized that no matter the work conditions, output was always higher when an experiment was being conducted. So researchers eventually revisited the study and concluded that the increased attention from supervisors during the experiment is actually what contributed to increased output. The worker participants in the experiment oftentimes got the opportunity to work in smaller groups, which turned out to be a morale booster for the workers, thus increasing output. What researchers and industries realize is that there are human beings with real feelings working in their factories. So these human beings like to be treated as such and not as just another piece to the machine that is American industry. There are some studies that dispute the Hawthorne effects, but I think no matter the results, no matter if they are accurate or not, what makes this study so impactful and important is that it really was the catalyst for the scientific management era ending, and an overall new perspective on business management is beginning. The impact that IO psychology has had on our society is outstanding. We started with a few tests on output and worker safety. During World War I, we see the development of job descriptions and intelligence tests for the Army, and then the Hawthorne studies finally helped bring the human element into the workplace. IO psychology has a pretty good projected job growth in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's safe to say that we are still studying the interaction between the human factor and output in the workplace. Our work here is not yet done, but certainly could not have been started if it weren't for the early contributions in the start of the 20th century with those three major events. We're looking at this graphic here, and if you have never interacted with anything on this list, I would be surprised, and you frankly would be very lucky. I feel that it's safe to say anybody who watches this knows about evaluations or bonuses or promotion. They've worked with somebody in HR before. You have been trained at your job. You have been given an interview. I know some of us have also needed to take personality tests or certification tests or any sort of other tests to be able to be in our workplace. Many people have been recruited or have worked in recruiting before. These are all major things that IO Psych has contributed to our society. Thank you for tuning into my presentation. I really enjoyed learning about all of the history of IO psychology. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.